It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Today on the Happy Families Podcast, a really important conversation about our kids and what goes into their bodies, or in all too many cases, what doesn't go into their bodies. We're talking about eating disorders on the podcast today. Hello, my name's Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the parenting expert and co-host of Channel 9's hit TV show Parental Guidance and dad to 6 daughters. Fortunately, haven't had to deal with too much in the way of eating disorders in my family, but the impact of eating disorders on children's lives, well, they cast a long shadow. It's not just a short-term thing, it's a long-term thing as well. I'm joined today by a special guest. Meg McClintock is an accredited practicing dietitian, an ANZ AED credentialed eating disorder clinician, and a positive body image advocate with 20 years of experience across both public and private healthcare sectors. She's founder and principal dietitian at Choose Nutrition and has a special interest in disordered eating and eating disorders, chronic dieting, weight, and body image concerns. Meg is also the co-host of the podcast Life's Too Short to Count Almonds and online course The Non-Diet Way. I like the sound of that. It makes me feel like I can eat connoisseur ice cream if I really want to. And she does that those podcasts and that online course with fellow non-diet dietitian Susan Williams. Meg is passionate about eating disorder prevention and doing no harm when providing nutritional guidance and when addressing eating and weight concerns across the lifespan. She works with individual schools and community groups to push back against harmful body ideals and build body positive spaces where people of all shapes and sizes are empowered to look after their bodies and thrive. It's a big introduction, but it's a big topic, and I think it's worthy of you, Meg. So thank you so very much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So there's a difference between not doing well with food and having an eating disorder. Okay, I mean I've got a bit of a sugar problem. I'm working on it. I eat too much ice cream. I really like the flourless orange and poppy seed cake, especially with that ice cream, the icing on it.
Delicious.
You know what I'm saying? And we kind of beat ourselves up about food, which surely has a negative effect overall on the way we approach food.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about this issue. Can we talk in general terms? What are we getting wrong as a society when it comes to the way we approach food?
Yeah, so unfortunately a lot. Like, we're pretty messed up when it comes to food and nutrition and bodies.
Break it to us gently, Meg.
But in a big picture, if I sort of put one sort of umbrella, we've really normalised sort of this culture of dieting. So if I sort of think along a sort of a spectrum from what might be sort of like natural eating, intuitive eating, healthy eating, we're listening to our body, we've got flexibility, we're nodding to nutrition and to, you know, all that sort of stuff. And right down the other end, we've got, you know, there's really harmful, really risky eating disorders, like diagnosable, meet the criteria.
Yep.
It's kind of a spectrum. So one step sort of up from sort of the eating disorder would be that sort of disordered eating. It's impacting some of your stuff. It's possibly mostly impacting like relationships, but possibly not physically. But it's, you know, it's pretty yuck and taking a lot of your headspace. But the next step between disordered eating and sort of natural eating, intuitive eating is dieting. And so it's just become really normal to be counting, controlling, restricting, earning, all this sort of language that we have in our culture is unfortunately a slippery slope to a really significant eating disorder for people who are vulnerable to that.
So what I'm hearing is, like, essentially, I'm probably simplifying this too much, but 4 levels. We've got healthy, natural, intuitive eating. Then we've got dieting. Then we've got disordered eating, where it's certainly impacting our lives in unhelpful and unproductive ways. And then there's actually eating disorders.
Yeah. Pretty grey in between those zones. Like,
yeah, I'd imagine they're not discrete sections. Something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, because I have, unfortunately, I'm not as healthy as I used to be, I think is probably the easiest way to say it. And I could do with some lifestyle changes that would improve my overall health. This is what happens when you've got 6 kids and you travel a lot for work and to write books and all that sort of stuff. They're all my excuses. But you know what the reality is?
All reasons. We can be more compassionate than excuses.
Well, I've come up with I've come up with a theory, and it really works for me. And that is this: my brain lies to me. My brain tells me so many lies about the calories that I'm putting in my body and the nutritional quality, what I need to do, what I want, what I don't want. And what I'm finding is that my brain is telling me yes when my body, if I listen to it, would actually say no. I don't really need. This is an embarrassing
Yes.
story, but a case in point. I was at a hotel in Sydney just recently. They fed me a beautiful pasta dish, which I just loved. And one of the great things about all the travel that I do is I do eat in a lot of restaurants. That's both good and bad, obviously. But then they brought me the dessert menu, and my body said, you've had enough. And then I looked at the prices, and my wallet also said, you've had enough. The lemon and rosemary gâteau looked so good. And it was $23 for dessert. And I just thought, that's obscene. That's excessive. I'm not doing it. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to do it. I don't do this often. I'm going to do it.
Scarcity mentality. There it is.
Oh, I know. They brought out a piece of cake. I kid you not, Meg. It was as big as a cake under normal circumstances. I don't know how big the cake must have been. This thing was massive, the biggest piece of cake I've literally ever seen in my life. And then my brain said, well, gee, that's big. Let's see how much you can do. And I ate most of it. And then I felt so bad. And I remembered again, my brain says yes, and it lies to me. It says, yes, you're going to enjoy this so much. And my body says, don't do it. But my brain seems to be stronger than my body in that situation. There is a question coming in this very long autobiographical story about me and my sugar addiction. And that is, how do we listen better to our bodies? And the follow-up to that is, how do we teach our kids that when it's so hard for us?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. But what we see, and this is really, really, really common with this sort of, in that stage down from sort of intuitive or natural in-tune eating, whatever you want to call it, in dieting, is this really well-defined cycle, which is the more we put something on a pedestal, the more we think something we shouldn't be having, the more we think, I'll eat it now because diet starts tomorrow and I'm not going to let myself have it tomorrow, or I've opened the packet now, so I'll eat it all so it's gone and then I won't have to worry about eating it tomorrow. All this controlling that we do to try to reduce how much of these foods we eat actually drives us to those very foods and disconnects us from, if you were able to sort of pause, sit down, go, that looks great. I don't feel like it right now, but I'm not going to be able to have it again in the future because this is rare. Just know, there's that scarcity mentality there of, I've got it here now. I've got these these experiences of getting in trouble for not eating all the food on my plate. And so the idea of not eating the whole thing now that it's in front of me, that's really uncomfortable. And so the easiest way to get rid of that discomfort is to just eat it. And so often it's actually sort of zooming out a bit, understanding what is driving the behaviour. So again, I love my imagery, but I sort of think of it as like got a tree, and the top of the tree, the leaves, the bit we see, the bit that often we might want to change, is that we're thinking about as behaviours, the things we don't like that we do, or the things we do like that we do. That's sort of the top. That's the canopy. Just telling someone, well, don't do it, or just giving someone information, it's kind of like watering the leaves. You might have shiny leaves for a while. You might be able to willpower, white knuckle it, hold on for a while, but it's really not where trees get their nourishment. We need to look down. And so they sort of think about the trunk. That's often where our thoughts and feelings hide, because they're the things that kick our behaviours off most instantly, those sorts of thoughts and feelings. But then we've got to go, well, where have they been informed from, and go under the ground. And that's where we've got things like our values. So our values around money, and I've spent the money on it, I don't want to waste it. Or our values on our health and nutrition. Our beliefs about I'm addicted to this and so I'm not going to be able to stop, which may be true or may not be true. And, things like our experiences, like that one I used before. If I get in trouble, if I've grown up getting in trouble when I don't eat everything on my plate, or I've got really strong values around waste and sustainability, I feel really uncomfortable at the idea of wasting this food or of missing this opportunity or whatever. And so the automatic behaviour is, well, I'm just going to deal with that by eating it. We need to sort of zoom out and try different things.
Two things, Meg, stand out to me as you're sharing this, especially when we get down to the roots and the values. One of them is on this idea of waste. I had my thinking completely revolutionised a little while ago when I was listening to a podcast with the founder of the founder of the US behemoth Whole Foods.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
This guy back in the 70s, hippie sort of living, and put together Whole Foods, and now it's a multi-billion-dollar Goliath in terms of helping people to eat food that's good for them and all about sustainability. But the guy actually said he's not so worried about food wastage because food is a renewable resource. Like you can always grow more food, especially when we're talking about the kind of whole foods that he's describing. We're not necessarily talking about killing animals and things.
Right, sure.
And,
Yeah.
and I thought that was a really fascinating reframe. And I've loosened up heaps on the idea that all the food on your plate now has to be eaten. There's the financial aspect, but in terms of the renewability of you can always cook more rice or whatever. That's really shifted.
Yeah.
And that value has changed the way I look at the way my kids eat what's on their plate.
Mm-hmm.
The second value that I just wanted to highlight is kind of at the other extreme. My dad probably eats a diet that has more sometimes food. Well, he eats sometimes food all the time, if you know what I mean. And his value is, you know what? I'm nearly 70 years old. I'll eat what I want.
Yeah.
I just want to enjoy my food. I don't care. And to the detriment of his health. But when I think about these, just the pervasive range of deeply entrenched values that drive the thoughts and the emotions that drive the behaviors, that model of the tree and the canopy and the roots, I guess I shared those two to highlight how powerful that can be.
Yeah. And I think it helps by having that sort of framework. We can, instead of sort of looking at our behaviours being like, oh, you idiot, you did that again, or why don't I have any willpower, or oh, I'm so bad, really negative shame spiral.
That's what I said.
You can go, hang on a minute. Right, yeah. We can sort of just pause and have this sort of compassionate look of, people are often trying their best and people are often doing really automatic behaviours without really having a time to even think about doing something differently. And so if we can sort of be curious and have a little look down and sort of understand what's going underneath, that's really where we're going to have an impact. I have a beautiful client I worked with a while ago who she knew that she wasn't hungry when she was driving home from work and she was going home to dinner, and yet she just kept sort of going through the drive-through and she didn't understand it. And so we did some digging, and goes right back to some food insecurity as a child, and the idea of being even tiny bit hungry and not knowing where your next food was coming from was so panic-inducing that she would just push it down. And so we had to do so much beautiful, calm, slow, compassionate work on, okay, let's acknowledge that. Let's learn to be comfortable with that. Let's remind you that you're not food insecure. You've got an option, and how can we work around that? So it's some trial and error and a lot of compassionate looking. Unfortunately, our culture is just like, well, just try harder, just have your willpower, completely ignoring like people's own experiences in life and how diverse that they are, their capacity to, financially their capacity. If they've got kids who are, really struggling to diversify their intake and they can't afford to be throwing food out all the time, or they've got, possibly some other trauma or just some really rigid beliefs around food, all of that stuff just becomes this cycle of going around and around doing the same thing, because our culture has the sort of the belief that you're out of control with food, you can't be trusted. This is like the general everybody, you can't be trusted, you're out of control, you need control, you need a diet. So people go and they do their diet, and the first stage is great, honeymoon phase. The first time you've gone around this cycle, it's pretty easy. People will, they're in a deficit, their body takes a while to adapt, and so they have this honeymoon phase where sort of it's working. And then sort of the next stage is, well, there's a cheat because there's a special event, there's an occasion, you get sick or whatever. And usually that's not the end of the story. People are like, nope, increase resolve, I'm back on the horse. And so they'll keep going and they'll keep doing the same thing. But their body goes, I don't like being in deficit. And so it increases their food preoccupation, increases their hunger hormones. There's a plateau with their weight change. Even though they're still doing all the same things, that's very frustrating in a culture that says just do it harder. And so someone who doesn't have a predisposition for eating disorders, usually that's just going to lead to so much frustration, hunger, irritation over it, that there'll be the end of the diet with this overcompensating of eating, so perhaps binging or just really forget it, I don't care, I'm eating everything, whatever.
But then they'd repeat the cycle and just diet harder,
Yes, and our culture is has the only answer it's ever sort of given us is, well, you failed, you need a different diet. That one wasn't right for you, you need to find the right diet. And because people have swung between control, restrict, count, limit, all that sort of negativity, or I don't care, I'm eating everything, whatever, they think they need the diet to stop the binging or the overcompensating eating or whatever, not realising, oh no, it's the restriction is the start of it. It's what's kicking it off. And so what sort of non-diet dietitians and what I do with my clients, either for the weight cycling or, of course, in eating disorders as well, particularly sort of more binge eating disorders, is really trying to offer a different way altogether that is outside of that diet cycle, which is with that paying attention to hunger and fullness signals, to what are your values, around food and health and nutrition. Because as you said with your dad, he has different values around health than you, and that's not necessarily better or worse. And so just sort of people understanding their own stuff, and then finding a way to look after their bodies, to look after their well-being, whole big picture well-being. And, obviously I'm a dietitian, so improving dietary quality is right up there on my priority list and my radar as part of that process. So we stop swinging and going round and round and round and round that diet cycle. And the more times you go around it, the shorter it gets, and the less, effective it gets. So as far as for weight loss, which I don't do weight loss, but no, that's a whole discussion for another day around intentional weight loss. But it does also become less effective as your body goes, oh, I know how to do this. I'm just going to down-regulate. I'm going to make you really hungry, and I'm going to get this cycle finished as quick as possible, because our bodies actually really like being in balance. So where this sort of leads, I guess, into eating disorders, for people who have a genetic predisposition for eating disorders, that dieting, that restriction, that controlling can really kick off the development of a really serious eating disorder.
We need to talk about that serious stuff, the eating disorders. I promised that at the very start.
We got off track. I know we did. That's okay.
But I love what you were talking about, and it's fascinating. I want to ask you to just to sort of finish off the question that I had asked previously. If you've got a child who is not eating well, who is clearly nutritionally deficient, and is probably eating lots and lots of white foods and yellow foods, but not getting the rest of the rainbow, and certainly missing out on the nutritional quality that would lead to a healthier childhood and help them to be more active. How do we help them to shift? How do we help them to move in a healthy direction without increasing the risk of, predisposing them towards an eating disorder?
Yeah, so obviously not having panic. So I think often people sort of panic and get really stressed about short-term eating behaviour, or what's happening for their kids in a sort of a discrete period of time, and put the pressure on. And what happens when we put pressure on kids is usually that sort of that pushback and that reaction.
Yeah, forced stress resistance. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so trying to zooming out of, okay, nutrition matters over a lifetime. And so we're going to be moving towards, where we would want as a family to our kids to be eating. But the best thing we can do for that is modelling, is continuing to offer a wide range of foods and that predictability. So there's a nice sort of phrase that can be useful, that sort of, it's a really gentle rule of threes, that kids, they need to eat around about every 3 hours and try to have something from all three macronutrients. Let's make sure there's some fat, some protein and some carbohydrate on offer at every time. And then we have these periods between meals where we're not eating, to work with our natural appetites. Another issue with our diet culture is it says, well, you read the paper and that tells you what and when to eat, as opposed to when you're actually hungry, or when your body tells you to stop. Our culture is like, well, but there's still more on your meal plan, or you haven't had your 5 veggies, you better keep going. So really trying to work with their inbuilt natural appetites and not destroy that connection, but actually help them have body trust. Continued exposure, like low pressure exposure, and modelling are probably the strongest things in there.
So 2 follow-up questions on that. Number 1, you said ideally kids should be eating every 3 hours. What age are we
around about?
Yeah, give or take. But what age are we talking about here?
Oh, so from sort of preschool through. It's generally how our school days are going to set up anyway. But just if we look at sort of the appetite hormones, there's a whole lot of different hormones involved in appetite, and one's for hunger and for fullness, and they kind of will sort of go in it's not exact science, but they'll go in a bit of a 3-hour cycle. And if we go too long, one thing is people can actually not feel the hunger because they can sort of turn off that connection because they're like, this doesn't feel pleasant. The other thing is that we can really disconnect from hunger and fullness and just, when the food comes, really overdo it. If there's predictability and kids know, I'm going to get another go at that later on, then they're less likely to eat all the stuff now because they don't know when they're going to get it again. And that's, linking in particularly to sort of your more binge eating disorders where the scarcity mentality. Think back to COVID and the toilet paper. Like people were like, oh no, I'm not going to have enough toilet paper. So they bought enough toilet paper for 3 years. It's a very human thing to have this
we're still working 2 hours right now and we got so I'm kidding.
And so we can apply it to, how often people think about food. If they think I'm not going to let myself have this again, or I only get this at parties because our house has none of this stuff in it.
Yes.
Often these are the kids that actually don't have their own off switch or don't have their own connection because they override it because of that desire, because it's delicious and it's enjoyable, but they're taught that it's really special and that they're not going to have it regularly.
Okay, so that takes care of my second question, because you also mentioned the word predictability around food, but what you're saying is they know that they're going to get food again in a couple of hours' time, three
Yeah,
hours.
absolutely.
Okay. Tell me, in terms of eating disorders, how prevalent are they in Australia? How much do we see this occurring in our kids?
Yeah, so if we think about all eating disorders, so often when we say eating disorders, people just think about anorexia nervosa, that really sort of stereotypical emaciated bodies, teenage girl, which is just such a tiny proportion.
Right.
So around about 4% of the total population will experience an eating disorder, but only 3% of those is anorexia nervosa. And so it's really broad spectrum. Some research suggests in Australia, adolescents experiencing disordered eating is up to around 30%. So that's the stuff that hides in plain sight, because in our culture that says, hey, dieting is normal, dieting is good, this is how you look, this is how you quote unquote look after yourself, those things which are quite disordered and causing possibly distress or shame or worry or just a whole lot of headspace being used up on food thinking are really normalised and are seen as, perhaps good. If we look at what is called atypical anorexia nervosa, which is all of the psychological distress and the physical risk of, our sort of typical anorexia, but without a low body weight. And there's some really interesting Australian research that showed that actually kids who started in a bigger body and lose a significant amount of weight are at higher risk of medical instability than kids who perhaps started in a small body and lost weight to an underweight stage, but because of their starting point, actually they are still at risk medically, and we want to help sort them out and get them out of deficit. But there's this whole cohort of kids who are naturally larger or who have just been bigger, who then do what society tells them to do and lose weight, which actually kicks off this really significant, really life-harming eating disorder that can hang around for years and years and years. But instead of getting help, they get congratulated or they get told, keep doing what you're doing. So weight loss in teenagers, even intentional weight loss in teenagers, it's not normal. That's the wrong direction, even for a kid who's perhaps in a larger body. It actually is like warning sign, red flag. But often missed, it's sometimes often in boys in particular who suddenly get like a gym obsession. They really want to go to the gym and they're counting their macros and they're doing this, that and the other. And everyone's like, he's so healthy. He's really looking after his health. And then, I've got plenty of clients who that was them as a teen. And it was years later that they were like, I was really unwell. I was distressed. I was body checking. I was weighing myself constantly. I was thinking about nothing of food. I had really low hormone levels. I was tired. I was insomniac. Like, life was awful. And yet on the outside, I was like, yeah, buddy, keep doing what you're doing. That's amazing. So it's really, it can be really hard. I have a heap of compassion for parents who want the best for their kids and have also grown up in this culture that has sort of a hierarchy of bodies and uses a body shape or size to decide if someone's healthy or not.
So I feel like I need to, I don't know if pushback is the right word, but I'm having a reaction to some of the stuff that you're saying, particularly around, there comes a point, though, when your body is simply unhealthy. And that may or may not have to do with the size of it, but clearly there's a correlation. The bigger your body, the more likely it is that you're going to suffer ill health. People who are...
Yeah, so there are definitely, it's a risk factor. So no one is sort of denying that, being in a larger body isn't associated with increased rates of different sort of, morbidity and mortality, different chronic diseases.
Yeah.
But when the research actually looks at behaviours, particularly on physical activity, behaviours and body size, the association between a higher risk and the body size actually goes away. And if we actually look at people's behaviours, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, not smoking and moving, those risks they really disappear. There's some really good research around particularly the impact of physical activity on risk. And the piece of the puzzle that often gets missed is our culture makes it really hard to just live your life happily and healthily if you're in a larger body. And so that weight stigma piece of the puzzle often gets missed. So we know this around, different minorities have increased risk of chronic and complex disease due to stigma, But we kind of miss that we've got a real weight stigma problem in our culture. So it's hard for kids to feel okay in their bodies if they're sort of outside of those thin ideals or those sort of normal body ideals.
So this is a podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers now. They're listening to this conversation. They're saying, okay, I get the general overall gist that this is a discussion about overall health rather than the size of my child's body. Nevertheless, I know that my child is not in a healthy body right now, and I want them to be healthy, but every time I talk to them about it, it backfires. They get defensive or they go and do something unhelpful or unhealthy. If I'm a parent who just wants my kiddo to make better decisions here, what would be your top couple of tips, top 3 tips that can really be actively followed by a parent who's struggling with this right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest thing is that your child knows that no matter what their size is, no matter what happens with their body, they are 100% loved, accepted. Their value in your eyes doesn't change that, because we don't look after things we don't care about. And so if kids are getting the idea that they're not cared for, or that their body isn't worth caring for because of the way it looks, they're not going to care for it.
I remember reading some research a couple of years ago that showed that kids, I think 9-year-old kids who receive messages from their parents that indicate that their parents are not satisfied with that child's body. In other words, hey, kiddo, you need to lose some weight. At the age of like 16, 17, they were, I don't remember how many times, but they were 2 or 3 or 4 times more likely to still be overweight or obese in their mid-to-late teens because of what they heard when they were 9.
Yeah, and if you're in a culture that says, oh, actually, you don't belong here, we don't have a uniform that fits you, or you don't look like the other kids on the sporting team or whatever, well, what are you going to do? You're going to withdraw. You're going to sit in your room. You maybe, increase your online presence, being on, computer games, because, well, you're safe, you're accepted there, no one's judging you on your body.
So number 1, unconditional love, right? Unconditional love.
Absolutely.
And really focusing on no matter how you look, you've got my love and my support.
Absolutely. So from there, you can then spring into that modelling, that regulation about what's good for all bodies. Because it's not like people who are naturally in small bodies, it's good for them to sit around and not do any movement and only eat donuts at McDonald's. And, so what's good for all bodies? So rather than having a sort of this is good for you and this is bad for you, we actually be like, what's good for everybody? Movement, stress management, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, eating regular meals, having that balance.
Yeah.
So that's the starting point is, if I wasn't worried about my child's body size, what would I be wanting them to do anyway? And starting there with those sort of conversations, because there's every single child who's in a larger body, they know it. We've got kids as young as 4. We can actually identify that there's levels of weight stigma that young. People don't need to be told. They need to be supported to look after their body as it is. And again, there's so much more we could talk about around how that might look, because it's going to be really different for different families. But at the end of the day, our bodies are worth respecting and looking after, no matter how they look, and that we undermine people's ability to look after their body by telling them there's something wrong with them.
Meg McClintock is an accredited practicing dietitian. You can find out more at Choose Nutrition. She's also the co-host of the podcast, Life's Too Short to Count Almonds. Love that title. Hey, Meg, thanks for joining me on the Happy Families podcast.
Been a pleasure.
If you'd like more information, we'll link to everything Meg related in our show notes. You can also check out happyfamilies.com.au. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And if you'd like more info about making your family happier and healthier, check out Choose Nutrition online with Meg McClintock, her podcast, Life's Too Short to Count Almonds, or visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.